I'm very pleased today to be able to introduce you to our guest speaker, Holly Gramazio. Holly, second year Holly's come to talk to students in writing in the city. Holly is a games designer, although possibly not quite the kind of games which might immediately spring to mind when we talk about games. So Holly has worked for an agency, but she now operates in a consultancy role, undertaking commissions, producing games for a range of different clients. So how this is going to connect to what we've already done in the course? Well, we've spoken about the emergence of network culture and increasingly the different forms of connection, but also disconnection that we experience in cities. And in response to that, there's been a trend towards what some people are calling gamification. Okay, that's one way in which organisations, individuals, brands try and communicate in this complex environment of a network culture. How do you reconnect people to people and with people in urban space? And that's part of what Holly's about. Mostly I think Holly is about having fun and enjoying games, and I'm sure that's what she's going to be talking about today. So I'll hand over to Holly, and you're welcome to introduce yourself more formally.
Yeah, like as you've just been told, I'm a game designer, and I tend to work with games that have at least some physical element. So sometimes it's purely physical games where people get together in public space and run around or sneak or hide or try to figure things out. Sometimes there's a digital element as well. So I recently did a game at a festival in Krakow where you went in and there was a hotel room which also had a digital game version of the hotel room on a screen on the desk, and it moved you between the two different versions and actually built up a soundscape based on what you were doing. But there's almost always some sort of physical element. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to talk through a few of the projects that I've done in the past to give you some sort of idea of where I'm coming from. Then I'm going to talk about the history of play in cities and play in public spaces and how it makes us relate to the environment that we're in different ways. Then I'm going to talk about some of the more recent stuff that's been done and the different categories that ways to disseminate city play can fall into. And just before I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I design games and why I think playing in cities is important. And it's a kind of very personal reason. I moved to London from Adelaide about 8 years ago and didn't really know the city very well. And I wasn't even planning to stay here for longer than 6 months or so. I was just going to live here for 6 months, travel around on weekends and find other smaller, less alarming, less stupidly expensive cities to potentially move to. And then after I'd been here about 5 months, I went with a few friends of mine to an abandoned warehouse in Wapping, where something was going to happen and I was quite vague on what it was. Someone had just said, hey, do you want to come along to this? And I said, yeah, sure. And outside this abandoned warehouse in Wapping were 150 other players, it turned out. And we were all given a white armband so that we'd be able to recognise each other. And then we were given a map with 6 locations across the city. And one of them was on Brick Lane, one of them was in Kensington Gardens, and you had to get to the final checkpoint in Waterloo by midnight. You had to get there by midnight because it was on the banks of the Thames and the tide would come in after midnight. So if you weren't there by then, you were out of luck. And that all seemed fairly straightforward. And then, like 20 actors appeared at the doors of the abandoned warehouse and up staircases. And they were wearing red ribbons on their arms, and they were wandering around kind of menacingly and picking people out of the crowd going, to get you, you're going down. And it was all very melodramatic and a bit silly, but also slightly alarming. And there was one of those guys on, you know, those big springy things that let you, like huge shoes with big sort of curved bits of metal attached so that you can run really fast, with red ribbons streaming off him. And we were told that these people would be chasing us, and that if they caught us, they would take our white ribbon and they would give us a red ribbon and we would become one of them. We would turn on our former allies and try to chase them down over the rest of the night. And it was just an extraordinary evening. Like, I'm not normally someone who likes running around. I like sort of a sedate walk, but I spent 4 hours in the rain, running frantically through London out of breath and sneaking around corners and finding out how weird bits of London connected that I didn't realise they would. And it made it feel like home in a way that it hadn't before. It made me feel like I had a sense of ownership of it, that there was something sort of safe and comfortable and mine about the city in a way that I just hadn't experienced before. Our brains do this weird thing where we don't usually like to play unless we feel safe in a place and feel like all of our other immediate needs have been satisfied. Play is something that comes after that. It's a thing you do from a position of safety and comfort. So your brain does this weird thing where if you're playing, then you must feel comfortable. This must be a place that's in some way home to you. And this worked really, really strongly on me. And at that point I thought, this is pretty great. Maybe I want to do things a bit like this. Maybe that's what I want to do now. And so I got into this sort of game design very, very explicitly through how it makes us relate to the cities that we're in and the cities that we can play in, which I guess is why I think this is important. So a few projects that I've done recently. This is a project called Games for Places in East Durham, in some little villages off to the east of East Durham. So we picked 5 or 6 different locations. This is part of a festival called East Durham Creates, produced by Former. We picked 5 or 6 different locations: a shopping centre, a couple of community centres, a park, a big weird sculptural bridge thing. And we designed really, really easy to play games, 5 or 6 of them for each location. Some things that were barely even games, things that we could explain the rules to in 2 or 3 sentences that took advantage of the spaces that you were in. And then we stenciled those on the ground and had them there for 3 weeks that you could just stumble across and potentially play. And when in each of the areas we'd also do some sort of customisation of the space to make it more playable. So in the park, because it was the end of autumn, we stenciled a load of 50, 60 autumn leaves all over the park, and we used those in the games. Some of them were games aimed mainly at kids, sort of quite simple, jumping from leaf to leaf. Some of them were a bit more complicated. Some of them were very, very minimal. There was one game that was just, if you're walking a dog, every time the dog goes over a painted leaf, you get a point, unless it goes over a yellow leaf, in which case you lose all of your points. And we watched how dogs behaved in the park. We put the yellow leaves in places where the dogs like to linger to make it more of a challenge for people. And obviously most people who read this stuff won't play it, but enough of the people do to make a difference. We sat around for an hour or 2 and watched people stumbling across them, and most people walk past, maybe 20-30% of people stop and read it and laugh to themselves a bit. And then, 1 in 20, 1 in 30 people will stop and actually play it. It's a really lovely thing to see. This was a game I worked with a choreographer called Brian Hartley on in Glasgow for the cultural programme around the Commonwealth Games. So we designed a sort of reimagined version of hopscotch and different things that you could do on that. So shut down Piney Street in Glasgow for 10 days, painted a load of these red and yellow and white dots up the street in a big long line and also in a circle, and gave people different games that they can play on those. Some of them sort of quite easy to do, like always step with your left foot on the reds and your right foot on the yellows and both feet on the white. Or more complicated things where you'd have to hold hands with someone else and only go up the left and right on each other. And trying to get people comfortable with the idea of the street as a thing that you can play on. We even had a few games that you can play using the yellow stripes along the side of the road, because those are stripes that will still be there after this project is over. I used to curate a festival called the Hide and Seek Weekend at the South Bank Centre, where 35 or so different artists would come along and show games with this sort of real-world element. So this is a picture from something that Slingshot Games from Bristol did, where different teams had these enormous, I think, GPS-tracked bundles of balloons that they had to race through to various checkpoints, and you would get enemy balloons at different times that you'd either be trying to track down or escape from. So, sorts of stuff that's kind of eventsy. There's also the picture that we had at the start was from the New Year Games, which was a thing that we did in Edinburgh in the beginning of 2012, where we had about 10,000 people playing over the course of a day. Had a cathedral with a labyrinth in it and a load of sort of hopscotch courses that eventually led to Scotch hoppers in dance space, and lots of people with enormous white cones on their head in the National Museum of Scotland and various things that are on there. So a lot of it is event-based, some of it is tinier and smaller and more incidental, like games and places that people can just stumble across. And people often ask me whether this is a new thing, whether this is a job that existed. Well, firstly they ask whether it is really my job, suspiciously, and then they ask how long this sort of thing has been going on for. And to some extent not very long. Come Out and Play in New York was the first festival to really start doing this on a grand, deliberate scale, and that started in 2006. But on the other hand, people have been playing in cities for a really, really, really long time. So in England, for hundreds of years, there was a thing that often happened on Shrove Tuesday, where whole villages would play a game of football. Sometimes, as you can see here, it's just the men and boys. Sometimes it would be everyone in the village. And the way the games tend to work was there would be one ball, and everyone in the village would split into two different teams. Like maybe the people from the one side of the river against the other, people from up the hill playing against people from the bottom of the hill. And there'd be goals, which were some distance outside the village, maybe up to a mile outside of the town square where things would start. This was the town square in Kingston upon Thames. And the way you play would be just your team had to get the ball to your goal once, only once, but everyone was playing, and so that was really, really, really hard to do. My very favourite story about this is a village near Derby, where one of the goals was a gate 1 mile out of the village in one way, and the other was a watermill a mile out of the village in this direction. So one of the players grabbed the ball and jumped in the river, knowing he was the strongest swimmer in the village, and no one would be able to get to him. He'd just be able to swim up the river to the watermill. And the rest of the people on the opposing team were, yeah, we're not going to jump into this cold river, Shrove Tuesday, remember, and try to get this ball from him. It's not going to end well for anyone. So they ran to the watermill and set the big wooden wheel churning so that the river was sending loads of water downstream and full of frantic waves everywhere, and he just could not get up to the watermill and had to land on the banks, and then they could get him. Less of it now, very few places where it's still played. Occasionally I've spoken about this and people have come up to me and said, oh, we still did that in the 80s, or even we still did that in the early 90s. But I think there's only 1 or 2 places where it's still played with any sort of seriousness now. Lobby Lud. This is arguably, well, this is one of the first commercially run big city scale games. This came in the 1920s. And was commissioned by, I think, the Westminster Gazette, definitely by a London-based newspaper. And they were kind of sad that in summer people would go on holidays and stop buying their newspaper, so they decided to try to do something to prevent that from happening. So what they would do is they hired an actor, and the actor played a character called Lobby Lud. It's this man with a pipe and a hat, sort of blurry pictures of him in the newspaper. This is the 1920s, remember? And they would print vague hints about where he was going to be, what seaside town he was going to be in a particular week, and what he might be doing over the course of that week, when he might be in different places, and whether he was wearing anything particularly unusual. And if you carried a copy of the newspaper to that seaside town and managed to find Lobby Lud and stepped up to him and said, you are Lobby Lud, you would win £5 or £10 or £20, depending on how long since someone last won it. And it was ridiculously popular. It was just massive. Tens of thousands of people played. He went to Richmond Park once and 50,000 people turned up. And he got to the gates of Richmond Park, and since his job was to not be caught, sort of wandered in and briefly scooted out another gate and went away. There's a story of when he went to Brighton on the very first day that this game ran. And no one was expecting it to be this huge. So he got panicked and sort of wandered along onto Brighton Pier. That's a really bad idea, because when you're on a pier, there's nowhere to dodge your cornered, right? And so he turned around and tried to dash away. People who looked a bit like Lobby Lud report getting shut in phone boxes with 20 people around him hammering on the glass going, Lobby Lud, Lobby Lud. And I just go, no, I'm just a man in a hat. There were special trains put on from Victoria to the towns where this was happening. It was immensely popular. This is one of the seaside towns where it was going on. Obviously, lots of people are just here for seaside town things, but also lots of them are here. They're choosing to go at this particular time and choosing to go to this place because Lobby Lud. See in the corner here a sign that says "Find Lobby." This wasn't actually the first newspaper commissioned city game. About a couple of decades earlier, around 1906, there was an incident called the Treasure Hunt riots. Lobby Lud was the first successful newspaper game publicity thing, as the name The Treasure Hunt Riots maybe suggests. Like, it's not a name that goes with a game that turned out well. The way the Treasure Hunt Riot, the way the Treasure Hunt, as they called it before they knew how bad it would go, worked, was that they buried a load of little metal discs around London with things like, on presentation of the officers of the paper, the finder will be given £50 in cash on them. And it's 906 £15, £50 is quite a lot of money. And then in the newspaper they printed kind of cryptic, vague directions about how to find these. Like, go by the broken green fence and turn left, list to the river, duck under a bridge, and then beneath the tree you will find the medallion. And the trouble with that is there are a lot of green fences in London, and there are a lot of bridges, and there are a lot of trees. So people would break into other people's gardens and try to dig them up. People would be shoveling up stuff everywhere in entirely the wrong places, trying to find these. After a while, the sort of police reports of trying to stop it and coming down on people who were digging these things up. And that I think one of these guys who found some stuff reports finding it, then having a police officer come along and him worrying that he'd been digging where he wasn't meant to, standing with his foot on the medallion and just digged up, going, yeah, all of this treasure hunt digging stuff that's going on is terrible, isn't it? And waiting till the police officer left so he could scoop up the medallion and go and claim £50. So it can go wrong. People can get very enthusiastic about stuff, and especially in the early years of any particular designer's work or any particular campaign or any particular resurgence of city games, there tend to be a few examples of things that don't quite work out. This is a jump to the 1970s. This is a still from the filming of the movie called The Last of Sheila, which was written by Anthony Perkins and Stephen Sondheim. And this is a slightly convoluted story. In the 1960s, Perkins and Sondheim ran really elaborate puzzle hunts around New York for their friends. The idea was that they'd give a clue to the first location, their friends would turn up, that clue would lead to other places. Sometimes they'd get other actor friends in to pretend to be a corpse or a decrepit person shaking their fist and secretly giving out clues, all around New York. And there's just little things that they did for their friends. And then they wrote a movie called The Last of Sheila and filmed the movie, which is about someone who runs this sort of cryptic treasure hunt, but also, spoilers, is a murderer. And then a guy called John Luskin in the early 70s, in I think Los Angeles, maybe San Francisco, watched this movie and thought, this is a great idea except for the murdering bit. And he set up a thing called The Game and The Game 2 and ran 4 different iterations of it, which was a public puzzle hunt style thing in the style of The Last of Sheila all around San Francisco, which is where a lot of the current sort of follow clues around the city stuff come from. And then, convolutedly, a different scriptwriter heard about that and wrote a movie called Midnight Madness based on it, which is an early 80s Disney movie about a guy who sets up the same thing and has teams trying to solve puzzles racing around the city, and it's run by a guy in a basement, and he's got 2 glamorous female assistants on roller skates with game control written on their t-shirts. And Midnight Madness then gave rise to like dozens and dozens of different people running their versions of this sort of thing, the idea that people would get together in a team and they would solve puzzles and it would lead them around a city. The thing that happens now commercially on a quite large scale, like a lot of people on hen and stag do's or on like team building exercises for their work will end up doing one of these things that initially stems back to this sort of okay movie. And then we get stuff that's more current. So there's things like Zombies Run, which is from a company called Six to Start, which is based in London. And the way this works is that it's an app that gets you to run by telling you there are zombies behind you. So you sign up to it, and each time that you run, you get an ongoing narrative about what's happening in this town that's besieged by zombies, and you get different tasks to go to, and if you want to, you can set it so that there's occasional random zombie attacks, and you have to run faster to get away from them. And so it's this the main reason that people tend to stick with it is that they really, really like the story. They keep getting these little bits of narrative that fit in with what they're doing. Within the story, you are a runner who has to go and try to get supplies for your little safe space and then run back to it with them. So it's, I think, definitely over 500,000 and possibly closer to 1 million sales by now. You get things like this, which is from a festival called, I think this is Playpublic, which is mostly a German festival, but ran in Poland last year. So you get things like the hide and seek weekend that I mentioned earlier, where people come along specifically to gather in a group and play things, and there'll be designers and artists and theatre makers and so on. Like, okay, this is what you need to do, this is how you play. But also, more and more, there's installations and thinking about how we can encourage people to play without necessarily being there. Like, it's quite easy to get people to play if you can stand on a bench and yell at 50 people and tell them what they're meant to be doing, but that doesn't really scale. So there's more and more of these systems that are having things like temporary or even permanent installations that just nudge people towards playing. So this, for example, is also from Playpublic. This is an artist's extremely long hopscotch course. You can just see her working at the bottom there. And occasionally it disappears into a drain and then it comes up a couple of streets over. I think by the end of the weekend, she just kept painting it through the whole weekend. She'd got up to around 2,000. And obviously no one's going to do the whole thing. But a lot of people wandering along will just do a little section of it. Or 5 or 6 people will start doing a little section of it, and then they'll gradually drop out, and the person who manages to stick with it the longest will triumph. It's just a nudge towards brief instances of more playful behaviour and getting people to, see the footpath as something that isn't necessarily just to take them from one place to another. This is by an artist called Beck. It's in Iceland. So there's this blue lit bridge going across, and when there's movement on a particular part of the bridge, that little part will flare pink. So what this does is, again, just as an installation, without anyone having to tell anybody else what to do, nudge people towards coming up with their own ways of playing with it. It's timed so that if you run really fast, you can just about light up the whole bridge pink before the far side starts turning back to blue. So people start doing that if they're on the bridge by their own. Or if there's several people on the bridge, they might sort of, without necessarily talking to each other about it, start trying to coordinate so that it alternates pink and blue all the way along. Or one person might be trying to keep things pink while the other is trying to sort of block them and keep it blue. So there's the affordances of it, the things that you can do with it are quite minimal. They're not complex, but the visibility with which it responds to you and the sense of power of making a whole bit of a bridge change colour just because you want it to encourages people to engage with it in that way. And this is a project called 21 Swings in Montreal. Swings are actually weirdly popular among playful installations, mostly because people understand them. You don't have to explain a swing. If you see a swing, then you sit on it, and if you like, you can swing. But also you don't have to, so the step into playing, which people can feel self-conscious and embarrassed and uncomfortable about, is quite a smooth one. You can just sit on a swing and use it like a seat if you want to, and then if you happen to want to swing back and forth a little bit, then so be it. And you can gradually get into it rather than having to make the active decision to jump in and be playing in public, which is a thing that we still tend to think adults don't do, even though that is historically and normally. So there's 21 swings along here, and they also make different notes when they swing backwards and forwards. So there's the individual play thing where you can just sit and swing, but also the potential collective play where you try to do it in time with each other or get particular notes going. Part of what I really like about this, and I haven't seen it in person, but part of what I like about everything I've heard about it is that there are just so many swings. Often there'll be an installation that uses swings for playful ends, but there'll be one of them. I don't know if any of you saw the birdcage outside King's Cross this summer. I don't know if it's still there, which has a swing in it. And it's it's lovely, it's a nice swing, it's got some good sort of swinging action on it, but if you sit on it, you're very conscious that there's only one of them and that it's always occupied, so there are other people who probably want to go, which kind of limits the extent to which you can get into things. And there is that sort of sit nearby, wait for a turn, go again, and the abundance of this I find really welcoming and sort of kind-hearted. So we've talked a bit about games in the city in the past and also in the present. So what I'm going to do now is sort of try to put them into 5 different categories, 5 different ways that people can be encouraged to see cities as somewhere to play. The first one is events. Events is probably the easiest of these. Like events is where I started all of my game design, certainly. You get a number of people together, maybe it's 5 or 10 or 50 or 5,000, and you set stuff up so that they can play. Maybe you close a road off, maybe you put a huge water slide down the middle of a street in Edinburgh or in Bristol. Maybe you hire actors to dress up with red ribbons and chase them. But it's a one-off thing where people gather specifically for the purposes of play. So they know they're there to play, so you don't even have to try to persuade them. And then you don't have to try to make it be a thing that works forever. You just do it this one time, and then it's done. And there's a lot of stuff that's really nice about that. You can do quite elaborate and extravagant things. You can shut down a road for 4 hours much more easily than you could shut down a road for 4 years, right? So you get people there who you know are sort of into the idea, so you don't have to persuade them to get over this little hump before they're happy playing. It can be very, very visible, and if you know that it's in a public space, you can think about what the role is for people who stop and watch, and whether they're able to join in, and if so, what the process is for that, whether you need to put 10 people there to explain and say, oh, you can go over there and have a go, or whether it's going to be self-explanatory, or whether you're going to have to sign up, anything like that. And it can be quite complicated in terms of what you're asking them to do. The New Year games that I mentioned earlier, we had big public games in 4 different buildings around Edinburgh, and we had a helter-skelter in the square, and we had 2 huge wicker statues and a stage. And the thing that we were asking people to do with all of this stuff and understand how it fit together was quite complicated. The idea was there were lots of different games that you can play, and each time you play a game, you get little metal coins, and then you come and put them in the buckets under your team's wicker statues. There were 2 teams, uppies and doonies. This drew on the Scottish version of the mass football game that I talked about earlier, where it was often uphill versus downhill, uppies and doonies. It had a big wicker statue of an eagle in blue and silver for the uppies, and the big wicker statue of a stag in red and gold for the doonies. You'd pick your team, you'd play anything, you'd go through the maze in the cathedral and try to dodge the Minotaur, you would go to the museum and try to find things on the ground with the big cone around your head blocking your vision, whatever it might be. And then you'd bring them back. In the square around the statues we had the Helter-Skelter that I mentioned. That was for a game called Helter-Skelter Bingo. You'd go up the Helter-Skelter, get a ball with a number written on it, slide down the Helter-Skelter and then walk out through a tent of people playing bingo and crossing out the numbers as they came. And then you could sort of, if you went up, kind of choose your numbers. So you'd have strategy going on of trying to figure out who on your team had what numbers and pick one when you go up. Kind of still that maybe the best moment of my professional life is in a hotel room sitting on the floor at 2 a.m. one morning writing in a spreadsheet, also a helter-skelter, and then 4 months later seeing people put up a helter-skelter in response to that. That was kind of amazing. But it was a big, complicated thing, and explaining that to you has taken like 2 minutes easily, and you can't keep people's attention for 2 minutes when you're just a sign or a piece of paper or something like that. You need to physically be there, and so events can be both more dramatic and more exuberant, and also more complicated in that way. The downside with events is they can be super expensive, and you only get to do them once, and then are gone forever, which can be kind of grim. You put a lot of work into something, and then 3 hours later it's gone. So there's upsides and downsides to all of these different things. This is another event. This is a festival in Spain. Have you done this already? Yeah, this is massive tomato fight. There's also an orange fight in a town in Italy, which sounds frankly far more uncomfortable. And this is the Minotaur from the Labyrinth in the New Year games. It was a sort of a circular version of Grandmother's Footsteps, this game, where you try and sneak in through the little maze made of broken pews and freeze whenever the Minotaur turned around to face you, and if he spotted you moving, you got sent out the maze, and you got plucked one of the ribbons off of his costume. We had 2 Minotaurs and were sort of frantically swapping them in and out every 20 minutes to go and send the other one away to have a breather and also get more ribbons stuck on him. You can do things more distributively by using sort of technological means to get the game ideas out there. So this is a picture of a game called Johann Sebastian Joust by a group called the Computer Fabric and a guy called Doug Wilson. This is a game using PlayStation Move controllers, which are those sort of things a bit like a black ice cream cone with a sort of a glowing thing on top of it. So like a big soft pixel, I don't know, like a spongy thing that lights up in different colours on top of a black stick. I should have really put a picture of this in. And the way this works is that 6 or 7 people all stand around with one of these Move controllers and press the button on them when they're ready, and they all light up in different colours. This is running off a computer which is somewhere in a corner. You don't need to look at the screen of the computer at any point. This is sort of technologically enabled real-world play. And then some music plays. It's dark and it's quite slow. You have to move around quite slowly. The speed you can move at is dictated by the pace of the music. And if you move too quickly, the little globe on top of your controller will flicker a little bit. If you move too quickly again, it will flash red and then go out, and you're out of the game. Sometimes the music speeds up, and then you can move around a little bit more quickly. And that's all quite straightforward, but what happens very, very quickly is that people figure out that if they nudge other people, then they'll move more quickly, and maybe their arm will flick out. Or if they sneak around behind, they can tap an arm and get somebody else out. Or, like, depending on where you are and how late it is, people decide it's a good idea to try things like high kicks or crawling under tables or hiding in the crowd behind people and then bursting out at the last minute going, you haven't got me yet. And the first time I learned this, it was at a games festival in Berlin, and the guy who designed it was running it, and he gets very, very into it. I had bruises down my arm at the end of the afternoon, and I didn't win a single game. But it's a really, really lovely game, partly because it only takes a couple of minutes to get the idea if you're watching, and also it only runs for a few minutes because people get out quite quickly. So after you're out a couple of times, if you want to have a break, then you just can hold up your controller, someone else will come and grab it. And they already know how to play because watching how people play it has taught them to do it. So you can have this organically going on with different groups of players for 3 or 4 hours at a time. This is a picture based on a thing that I did when I was at Hide and Seek, which was called Tiny Games, which was a not totally successful, but with some interesting points to it, app that we made that was in this sort of thread of trying to use technology to enable real-world play. So the idea of this app was that you could go, oh, there are 4 of us, we're in a park, we're in such and such a mood, this is the stuff that's around, and it would suggest games that you could play there, then and now. It was based on a project we'd done the year before, where designed site-specific games, a bit like the ones I talked about in Games and Places, for 99 locations around London and 3 in each borough, and stuck them on the ground on big stickers. There was actually one out the front here back in the day.
You're playing Tiny Games.
Oh, great.
So.
Yeah. And this is from Google's weird augmented reality play in the city game Ingress. Obviously you do not literally see glowing green screens floating in front of you. You do it all on your phone or on your computer and they go out. But the way it approximately works is that there are different teams trying to control particular spaces in the city. And you control space by walking around it, walking to it and walking between other spaces. And various things you can do makes them more protected. it's not played by a huge number of people compared to the amount of money that's gone into creating it, but Google kind of doesn't care. What they actually want is the data of how people walk around and where the footpaths are, so that they can give better directions on maps and things like that. So this is essentially a giant game just designed on getting people to have their phones on them while they're walking around, telling Google where they're walking, which is clever but also weird. Makes me slightly uncomfortable. Another way of doing it is installations. They have some of the advantages and disadvantages of events, right? It's a big physical thing. It gathers attention by being there in space. With technology, it's not usually visible that there's necessarily anything special going on. It's not clear how, if you wanted to play whatever these people are doing, you would do that. But on the plus side, it's really, really easy to distribute. You can make a thing and then people in cities on the other side of the world can play it without you having to go there and sort of build a thing or stand on something and explain to them what they're meant to do. And installations, like events, are kind of the opposite of technologically enabled physical play in this way. But there are interesting things you can do around them. I quite like this at the South Bank Centre, partly because it's 3 slides of different heights. One of the things I like about this is that it can be quite difficult to get adults to play. If there is a single kid playing, you'll see 30 or 40 adults potentially step back and go, oh, it's a kid's thing. We aren't allowed to have this fun. This fun is not for us. Or if we try to do this, we'll look stupid. A lot of kids get enough chance to play already. I feel like more effort into allowing adults to feel like it's okay for them to have a turn is, I think, a really good thing. And something like this, with 3 different heights of slides, kind of does that. It's a thing where you go, oh, I mean, this is for kids, but maybe it's also all right for me. It's the same way that museum installations will often have, the interactive installations will often have 2 things to interact with at different heights. And they might be exactly the same interactive thing, and it might be that if you put them in the middle height, both kids could reach it and adults could reach it, but just having to and having them at height is an active gesture of this is for everyone, this isn't just for adults, this isn't just for kids. You are, if you are an adult, clearly kids cannot interact with something at this height, therefore it must be meant for you. And I think installations can do that sometimes really effectively in a way that even events struggle with. And events sometimes had to send people around listening to adults going, oh, I guess this is for kids, and then say, oh, actually it's not, it's for everyone, which sometimes works and gets them playing, and sometimes people don't want their conversations listened in on just so that you can encourage them to play. We tried that once or twice and then stopped doing it. This is a version of Death Behind the Appearing Rooms that you might have seen at the South Bank Centre. At the South Bank it's just 2x2, here it's 3x3. I have not seen this in person. It seems amazing. The fountain and the balls go up and then they go down, and you can jump between one and the other and try to race from one corner to the other without getting wet. Get stuck in the middle. Do not think that it would be a good idea to just walk straight through the water and get to the other end faster if you're ever competing with a friend, because you will get literally as soaked as if you had just stepped in the river. There is an extraordinary amount of water being pumped out of these things. And again, this is quite an implicit invitation to play. It's a thing where no one is actively saying what the rules are, but as with Team Bex on the bridge, there's enough possibilities that people will make up their own things to do. And there's enough space that adults will usually get involved as well as children. And this is in Bristol recently over autumn or late summer. This is called Shadowing. It's part of the Playable Cities Award, which is a thing Bristol does every year where they commission someone else to do a big installation thing in the city. And this is 7 or 8 lampposts around the city which record other people's shadows passing under, and then when someone else comes along they play back previous people's shadows. So you can play with other people's shadows and try to dodge them or try to match them, and you can also set up your own for future people. So with things like installations, there's a load of advantages around visibility and coaxing people in and it being there all the time, which is amazing. But there's some disadvantages around it has to be quite simple, and there's a lot you can do with it, but you can't do anything that needs people to stop and read rules for more than 20 seconds or so, because they won't. You know, you can do play, but you can't do games, as it were. Another way of transmitting play in the city is just through ideas, right? The don't step on cracks thing. No one put up a sign anywhere or got an event together where they explained to 1,000 people, okay, for the next hour I want you to walk around the city and you get a point for each crack you don't step on. It's just a thing that someone said once and then someone else said, or that a load of people have come up with independently and spread on their own. It's just transmitted just through saying what the rules are in half a sentence. This is a game called Ninja, which is a little bit like a turn-based Johann Sebastian joust. Group of people standing in a circle, you take it in turns to try to tap the hand of one other player. If someone attacks you, you get one movement to go away. If you're attacking, you get one movement to try to tap their hand. And the play goes around the circle. It's sort of turn-based, so it's much sort of slower than Johann Sebastian joust until people gradually get eliminated. And this came out of more or less nowhere 10 years or so ago. And now, like maybe one time out of 10 or 12 that I'm sitting in a park, I'll see a group somewhere in the distance playing Ninja. This is a game that a friend of mine explained to me a week ago, which is that whenever one of us sees a dead Christmas tree, we will text the other. The person who sees a dead Christmas tree latest in the year is the winner. She says that last year she saw a dead Christmas tree in August, so she's confident of her victory this year. But she doesn't know that there is in fact a dead Christmas tree sitting in a corner of our garden that I'm pretty sure isn't going to be taken away anytime soon. And finally, the final thing that I'm going to talk about as a way of transmitting play is through architecture, which has a lot of things in common with via installations, right? It's big physical instantiations, but it's more permanent and it can be grander scale and it can be built in right from the beginning. This is the sort of thing that very few game designers have ever got to be involved in. I'm hoping that that will change over the next 10 or 20 years. Certainly, I cannot imagine what sort of public spaces we might get if game designers and architects started working together on them, given that people, even without the specific intent of play, have managed to make a lot of spaces that encourage it. This is the Festival Plaza in Adelaide, where I'm from. And as a plaza for people to hang out in goes, it's kind of terrible because it gets really hot there. It's, in Australia it's till 40 degrees in summer. There's not much shade. It's not really near anything. There's no cafes. And it's also around the corner from like a huge expanse of green shady grass on the bank of the river. So who's going to sit here? But in terms of playing, it's great. It's usually empty of people using it for its intended purposes and has 4 or 5 like teenagers usually like hiding behind things and jumping from thing to thing and making up their own ways to play them. This next thing that I'm going to show you is the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. This is not a thing that was intended in any way to encourage play, but it's very interesting because something about the space has done that. They have to have explicit rules about not playing in the Holocaust Memorial, which you would think would not be a thing that you need to do, right? And it's because you get this sort of places where people can be seen and not seen, and where they can feel secluded from the public while still being in this big urban space. So people come up with usually a game where they're just trying to run around and see their friends before their friends see them. And you have to act, there are guards there who actively discourage play. It's a thing that is officially not allowed, but happens over and over. A massive Holocaust memorial, just because the architecture non-deliberately encourages it to such a degree. This is a thing from Olympic Park. This is more deliberate. This is super lovely. This is just a big rubbery expanse. I don't know if it's still there now, so during the Olympics, where there are lots of splotches of different colours. And almost all of the children walking across this, and maybe one in 8, 1 in 10 adults would, without being told, pick a colour and try to get from one side to the other, stepping only on that colour. It's an invitation that is implicit in the sponginess of the ground and the blotchiness of the colours. And you don't need to tell anyone to do it, people just do it. This is a 50-metre trampoline in some woods in Russia, installed partly as a sort of a thought experiment about ways to speed up people's commute. But I don't think anyone has sort of a realistic belief that that's something that will actually be done on a grand scale. It's just about having this sense of progress and this different way of relating to the forest, a sort of bounding, jumping way. And finally, this is, I don't remember whether the first one was also San Francisco, I might be wrong. This is just a building where passers-by can turn around panels and make them all sorts of different colours. Just, again, this little tangibility and the sense of being able to change something in the physical environment in a city that is normally immense and solid and impervious to you is incredibly powerful. So, in conclusion, there are a load of different ways that you can encourage people to play in the city. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, but the thing they have in common is that they can make people feel differently about a space. They can make people notice things they otherwise would never have noticed. There are places in London that when I walk through still feel like an arena of combat from the time I was chased through them 8 years ago. Playing in cities, it should happen more. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for a few questions, if any of you have questions.
How did you get involved in it?
I made a few games without anyone paying me to do it and just took photos of it. And then also went around telling people I was a freelance game designer for a couple of years. And very occasionally someone would go, yeah, all right, I guess, and pay me to do something small and I'd take photos of that. Yeah, a couple of years of definitely saying, yes, I'm a freelance game designer. I do work in public space. And then eventually I wasn't lying anymore.
A few comments, Ollie, and questions. That last example of the memorial, the Holocaust memorial, is extraordinary because that's architecture which is produced to have a very deliberate, an affect. It's meant to make people feel, and think, and pause. All the things you want from a memorial of such a scale. And as you say, actually inadvertently, the way that's designed means that some people actually have quite a different kind of reaction.
Yeah.
And I think that's really fascinating insight into the relationship between planned space and the way places are actually used. Yeah, we talk a lot about the kind of the functionist planning, which predetermines how people are meant to behave, as opposed to the way people actually, in the real world, kind of do behave. So that's really interesting. My other comment was on the Ingress example. I don't know if anybody plays Ingress here. You play, right? So that's fascinating. So you can see this really rich history that Holly's kind of talked through of play in cities and games, which are, they've always been bound up with commercial imperatives. So the great examples of the publicity, just in the summer nobody reads newspapers, so get them to buy newspapers. Really interesting stuff. But of play for play's sake is obviously really cool. But Google comes along and they provide this wonderful platform for really engaged and interesting play. And essentially it's data harvesting with the ultimate effect presumably of making maps personalised so that people never ever get lost and never actually ironically kind of have to wander and encounter new things. Is that what's your take on that? You said you thought it was weird.
Yeah, I do think it's a bit weird. I guess I'm sort of worried about it from a professional perspective, which is that people think playing in cities is a bit strange anyway. And if the big, well-funded, prominent example of it is Google harvesting people's data, then I guess I'm a bit worried that will affect how people see the medium I work in. So it's a very selfish worry. I think as a game there's a lot of really neat stuff about it.
Final question. You've done work for a lot of different organisations. Yeah. What did the brief say? Did the brief say, look, you put on a game, this is all the rage? Or did they say, we want people to think about a specific space in a certain way? Or, do you get a range of briefs, or is there?
Usually if I get a brief that we want some sort of cultural activity, I won't go for it unless there's a really clear indication that they think of games as cultural activity. Because often that means we want outdoor theatre or something. And that's great, but it's not really worth my spending 2 days having ideas for them. So if I get a very general brief, I'll probably talk to them before I do it. Sometimes I get briefs specifically about games and play. Often I get focus for people going, we've got this festival at such and such a time, we have this much money. What do you think you could do for it to convince us it's a good idea?
I know Hide and Seek, the agency you worked for, they were involved with some commercial brands. I mean, are you familiar with brands who say, we want people to play a game that communicates our brand values? Have you had that kind of briefing?
Yeah, they don't usually really mean it. It's
Right.
usually more trouble than it's worth.
Right. Okay, if there are no more questions, we'll just say thanks again to Holly, and